The air inside the restaurant was thick, heavy with the smell of expensive steaks, garlic butter, and the sharp tang of red wine. It was a Friday night at the Gilded Key, which meant the noise level was deafening. Glasses clinked together in celebration. Deep laughter boomed from the corners of the room, and the constant hum of conversation created a wall of sound that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards. Elena moved through this chaos like a ghost. She was 59 years old, though the lines around her eyes and the gray streaking her hair made her look a little older. She wore the standard black uniform that the management required, a long-sleeved button-down shirt and a skirt that was just a little too tight around the waist, and comfortable black shoes that had lost their shine years ago. In one hand, she carried a heavy tray loaded with dirty plates, and in the other, a silver pitcher of ice water. She weaved between the tables, dodging a waiter rushing past with a tray of lobster tails. She didn't look at the customers, not directly. Over the years, she had learned that if she made eye contact, they would ask for something, or complain about something, or simply look right through her, as if she were a piece of furniture. Being invisible was easier. It was safer. "Excuse me," a man's voice called out sharply, not looking up from his phone. "More water, now." Elena didn't flinch. She simply stepped over to the table, placed the pitcher down gently, and poured. She didn't say, "You're welcome," because he hadn't thanked her. She just turned and walked away. Her feet throbbed inside her shoes. She had been on her shift for 6 hours already, and the kitchen was backed up, which meant the customers were getting impatient, which meant the staff was taking the heat. She walked past the grand piano that sat in the corner of the room. It was a beautiful instrument, glossy black and polished to a shine, usually bathed in its own warm spotlight. Tonight, however, the spotlight was off, and the piano sat silent with its lid closed. Usually, by this time of the evening, a pianist would be playing soft jazz to cover the clatter of the kitchen. The music acted as a lubricant for the social machine of the restaurant, smoothing over the awkward silences and making the diners feel sophisticated. Without it, the room felt raw. The laughter sounded harsher. The clinking of silverware sounded louder. Elena brushed her fingers against the cold wood of the piano as she passed, a habit she had developed without realizing it. She kept walking, heading toward the back to drop off her heavy load of dirty dishes in the kitchen. The heat was overwhelming. Chefs were shouting orders, pans were sizzling, and servers were bumping into each other. Elena slid the plates into the plastic tubs and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She caught her reflection in the metal door of the fridge for a second. She looked tired. She felt tired. "Hey, Elena," a younger server named Ben said as he hurried by. "Manager is looking for you." Something about the VIP in the corner. "He's asking why there's no music." Elena sighed, grabbing a clean cloth. She didn't want to deal with the manager's stress right now. She just wanted to finish her shift, go home, soak her feet, and maybe watch a little television before falling asleep. But she nodded to Ben and walked back out onto the floor. That the dining room was even more crowded now. Every table was full. The energy in the room was shifting, though. It wasn't just busy. It was tense. People were starting to notice the silence. They were looking at the empty piano, then at their watches, then at their waiters with annoyed expressions. Elena saw the manager, a tall man named Mr. Higgins, standing near the entrance. He was pacing back and forth, looking at his phone, then looking at the room, his face red with panic. He was a man who liked order, and tonight, everything was falling apart. The pianist, a young man usually reliable and punctual, had called in an hour ago. He had the flu, or maybe his car broke down. The story kept changing. The point was, there was no music, and the restaurant had a very important guest tonight. A local politician known for his love of fine dining and his short temper, was sitting in the best booth in the house. He had requested a specific song for his dessert course, and he expected excellence. Mr. Higgins spotted Elena and waved her over. He looked frantic. "Elena, have you seen the new guy?" he asked, speaking fast. "The one who fills in on weekends? I've been calling everyone. I have 4 numbers. Nobody's picking up." Elena shook her head slowly. "I haven't seen him, sir." "Is there a problem?" "The problem is that there is no music," Mr. Higgins hissed, keeping his voice low so the customers wouldn't hear. "Look at them. They are getting restless. It's too quiet. People eat faster when there is no music, and then they leave, and then I have empty tables on a Friday night. Plus, the mayor is watching the piano like a hawk. I need someone, anyone who can hold a tune." Elena glanced over at the corner booth. The politician was there, a large man with a thick head of gray hair, gesturing angrily at his companion. He looked like a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. "I don't know anyone, sir," Elena said gently. "It's Friday night. Every musician in the city is working." Mr. Higgins ran a hand through his hair, looking defeated. He looked around the room as if he expected a musician to magically drop from the ceiling. "This is a disaster," he muttered. "A total disaster." Elena looked at the piano again. It was sitting there in the shadows, silent and waiting. She felt a strange pull in her chest, a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a mix of nervousness and a strange, aching nostalgia. She remembered being a little girl, standing on a crate to reach the keys of an old, beaten-up piano in her school hallway. She remembered the way her fingers felt, light and quick, dancing across the ivory. She remembered the music filling her up, pushing out all the fear and the confusion of growing up poor in a city that didn't care about her. But that was a lifetime ago. That was before she had to work 3 jobs to pay the bills. Before the arthritis started to settle in her knuckles. Before life just sort of happened, sweeping her dreams away like dust in the wind. She looked at her hands. They were rough, red from the hot dishwater, and her nails were cut short for practicality. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist. They looked like the hands of a woman who scrubbed floors and carried heavy trays. "I'll be right back," Elena said to the manager. "What? Where are you going?" Mr. Higgins snapped. "Just to the restroom." "I'll be quick." Elena walked away, but she didn't go to the restroom. She walked to the side of the room, near the potted plants, where she could watch the piano unseen. She watched a young couple walk past it. The man sat down on the bench, pretending to play a few choppy chords, making his girlfriend laugh. He stood up, and the piano was silent again. The room felt wrong without the music. It felt hollow. Elena knew that the manager was right. The atmosphere was souring. People were rushing their food. The magic of the gilded key was fading, and without it, it was just a noisy room with overpriced food. She looked at Mr. Higgins. He was on the phone again, pleading with someone, begging them to come down with a guitar or a violin or anything. She could hear the desperation in his voice. She knew that if she could help him, she should. He wasn't a bad man, just stressed. And she needed this job. If the restaurant had a bad night because of the music, he might take it out on the staff. He might cut hours, but it wasn't just about the job. It was about the silence. She couldn't stand the silence. It felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Elena took a deep breath. She felt her heart beating a little faster. It was a crazy idea. It was a dangerous idea. What if she couldn't do it anymore? What if her fingers were too stiff? What if she forgot the notes? The embarrassment would be unbearable. She would have to quit immediately. She would have to move to a different town. But then she looked at the politician. He was waving his hand in the air, trying to get the manager's attention, clearly annoyed. The tension in the room was rising. Someone dropped a glass, and the sound shattered the quiet, making half the room jump. It was like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Elena made a decision. She walked back toward the manager. He was just hanging up the phone, looking hopeless. "Mr. Higgins," she said. He turned to her, his eyes tired. "Not now, Elena, please. Unless you know Beethoven and he's hiding in the kitchen." Elena put the rag she was holding into her apron pocket. She smoothed down the front of her shirt. She felt her hands shaking slightly, so she clenched them into fists and then released them. "I used to play," she said. Her voice was quiet, barely audible over the noise of the room. The manager stopped pacing. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time all night. He frowned, confused. "You? You used to play." "A long time ago," Elena said. "Before I came to this country. Before. A lot of things." The manager stared at her. He looked at the old woman in the stained uniform, the woman who refilled his water cooler every morning and swept the floors every night. He couldn't picture it. It didn't compute. "I don't know, Elena," he said, rubbing his temples. "This isn't the time for jokes. We need a professional. This is the mayor." "I know the piece he likes," Elena said softly. "I heard him ask for it last time. It's Claire de Lune." The manager paused. He looked at the angry VIP in the corner. He looked at the restless room. He looked at the empty piano. He was out of options. He was drowning. "You know Claire de Lune?" he asked, skepticism heavy in his voice. "I know it," she said. "I can play it." The manager let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at the piano and back at Elena. It was a risk. A huge risk. But the alternative was a total disaster of a night. "Okay," he said, waving his hand toward the instrument. "Go. Just try to keep it quiet. Background music. Don't disturb anyone." Elena nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. She felt a lump in her throat, hard and nervous. She turned away from the manager and began the long walk across the restaurant floor. With every step, she felt heavier. The room seemed to stretch out. The distance to the piano felt like a mile. She passed table after table of people who ignored her. She passed the bar where the bartenders were frantically mixing drinks. She passed the waiters running with trays. She reached the small platform where the piano sat. The spotlight was still off, leaving the bench in shadow. Elena stood there for a moment, looking at the closed lid. It looked like a coffin sealed shut. She reached out and touched the cool wood. It felt smooth and solid under her fingertips. She looked back at the room. No one was paying attention to her. Why would they? She was just the waitress. She was the invisible woman. Elena stepped up onto the platform. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She sat down on the bench. It was firm and cushioned. She adjusted her position, flattening out her skirt. She reached out and placed her hands on the fallboard, the piece of wood that covered the keys. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, so hard she thought the people at the nearest table might hear it. Asterisk, what am I doing? She thought. Asterisk, I can't do this. It's been 30 years. Asterisk, she took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of lemon polish and old wood. She closed her eyes for a brief second. She pushed the fear away. She thought about the silence in the room, the tension, the anger. She thought about the music that used to live inside her, the music that never really left, just went to sleep. She opened her eyes. With a gentle push, she lifted the fallboard and let it slide back into the piano. The keys were exposed, white and black, waiting in the dim light. They looked like old friends she hadn't seen in years. Elena flexed her fingers. Her joints clicked, a reminder of her age. But as she hovered her hands over the keys, the memory of 1,000 hours of practice took over. She forgot the restaurant. She forgot the manager. She forgot the uniform. She lowered her hands. She didn't start with Claire de Lune. She decided she needed to test the waters first. She needed to warm up. Her fingers found a chord, a simple C major. But she played it with a weight, a richness that didn't match the simple notes. Then, she began to play dot. It started as a murmur, a low, rumbling bass line that seemed to rise up from the floorboards. It wasn't a polite background melody. It was something else. It was strong and confident. A few heads turned. Not many, just a handful of people who noticed the sound changing. Elena didn't stop. She let the music grow. Her left hand maintained the steady, driving rhythm, while her right hand began to dance. It started slow, exploring the keys, remembering the touch. Then, faster. The notes cascaded down, crystal clear and sharp dot. It wasn't classical anymore. It was jazz. It was improvisational, wild and free. It was the kind of music that grabbed you by the collar and demanded you listen. The man at table 4 stopped talking. He put his fork down. He looked over at the corner, his eyes narrowing. The bartender paused, a shaker in midair. The music swelled. It filled the room, cutting through the smoke and the noise. It was complex, intricate, and undeniably professional. It sounded like a recording, except it was live, right there in the room. Elena's hands moved with a life of their own. Her face, usually tired and masked, changed. Her eyes closed. Her mouth opened slightly, a look of pure concentration and joy washing over her. The roughness in her knuckles disappeared. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a musician. The room was falling into shock. One by one, the conversations died out. It wasn't an immediate silence. It was a wave. It started near the piano and moved outward. People stopped chewing. People stopped drinking. They turned in their seats, looking for the source of the sound. They expected a man in a tuxedo. They expected a young prodigy. They saw a woman in a black apron sitting on a bench, her back straight, her head bowed, pouring her soul into the keys. The manager stood frozen near the kitchen, his mouth hanging open slightly. He looked at Elena, then at the customers, then back at Elena. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The song built to a climax, a thunderous run of notes that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. Elena played with an aggression, a passion that had been bottled up for decades. She was telling a story with the music, a story of struggle, of hard work, and of a secret fire that never went out. That, as the final, resonating chord hung in the air, the silence that followed was absolute. The whole room was frozen. The waitress had taken a seat at the piano, and instantly, the room had fallen into shock. The silence that followed the final chord was not empty. It was heavy, weighted down by the sudden realization that hung in the air like smoke. For a long moment, nobody moved. The piano's resonance seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards and into the soles of the diner's shoes, commanding them to stay still. Elena sat with her back straight, her hands hovering just above the keys. Her chest rose and fell with deep, rhythmic breaths. She did not turn around to see if anyone was watching. She did not look for the manager. She simply waited, letting the shock of the sound settle into the room. She could feel the energy shift behind her back. The chaotic, aggressive noise of a busy restaurant had been sucked away, replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. A young woman near the bar was the first to move. She slowly lowered her wine glass, which she had been holding halfway to her lips, completely forgotten. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the corner of the room where the old waitress sat. Then, a man at a center table dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against his plate, breaking the spell, but he didn't even flinch. He just stared, his mouth slightly open. The manager, Mr. Higgins, stood frozen near the kitchen doors. He had seen thousands of musicians come through his restaurant over the years. He had seen students trying to make extra cash, professionals who thought they were too good for the room, and weekend warriors who knew 3 chords. But he had never seen this. He looked at Elena, the woman who asked for extra shifts to pay for her grandchildren's birthday presents. The woman who complained about her sciatica, and he didn't recognize her. She didn't look tired anymore. She didn't look small. Elena flexed her fingers. The stiffness in her joints was still there, a dull ache that had lived in her hands for 20 years, but it felt distant now, pushed aside by the adrenaline flooding her veins. She knew she couldn't just stop. The silence was too loud. She had to give them more, and she had to give it to them before her courage ran out. Without a pause, her left hand dropped down to the lower keys, striking a deep, resonating bass note. It was the sound of a heartbeat. Then, her right hand began to move. This time, the music wasn't a loud, crashing jazz piece. It was softer, intricate, and weaving. It was a melody that felt like a memory sweet, sad, and incredibly beautiful. She played Clair de Lune, the piece the politician had asked for, but she didn't play it like a polite background track. She played it with a depth that made the air feel thin dot as the notes flowed. The atmosphere in the room transformed completely. It was no longer a place of business. It was a sanctuary. The tables closest to the piano stopped eating entirely. A couple who had been arguing in low whispers stopped mid-sentence. The anger drained out of the man's face, replaced by a look of wonder. He reached across the table and took his wife's hand, something he hadn't done in years. Even the staff, usually rushing frantically with their heads down, began to slow down. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes stopped to listen for just a moment, mesmerized. He didn't care about the tip. He just wanted to hear the next phrase. The bartender stopped polishing glasses. The cooks peeked out through the serving hatch, wiping their hands on their whites, listening to the sound cutting through the grease and heat of the kitchen. The music was telling a story. It wasn't just notes on a page. It was Elena's story. Every person in the room could feel it, even if they didn't know her. They heard the loneliness in the lower octaves and the hope in the high trills. They heard the decades of hard work, the feeling of being invisible, and the sheer power of not giving up. It was human and raw dot in the center booth. The politician sat back in his chair. He had been annoyed, ready to storm out or demand to speak to the owner. But now, he closed his eyes. The stress of his job, the noise of his campaign, the expectations of the people around him, it all faded. There was only the music. He found himself breathing slower, his shoulders dropping as the tension left his body. He wasn't a VIP right now. He was just a man listening to a song Elena played on. She lost track of time. She forgot she was sitting on a padded bench in a restaurant. In her mind, she was back in a small, dusty apartment in her childhood home. She saw her mother humming while she cooked dinner. She felt the hope she had when she was young, the belief that music could change the world. Her fingers, usually so stiff and slow, moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a woman of her age. They danced across the ivory keys, independent of her brain, driven by muscle memory and pure emotion. She built the melody up, layer by layer. The music grew stronger, more confident. It filled every corner of the high-ceilinged room. The clinking of silverware had stopped completely. No one was talking. The only sound in the entire restaurant was the piano. It was a strange sensation for a dining room 50 people holding their breath, afraid that if they made a noise, the magic would break. Alana's foot pressed gently on the sustain pedal, and the sound swelled into a lush, beautiful chord. She held it, letting the notes hang in the air, vibrating with emotion. Then she began to transition. The gentle sadness of the classical piece morphed into something with rhythm. A bluesy vibe crept in. Her left hand started to keep a steady, swinging beat. It was a risk, mixing styles like this, but she didn't care. She was having a conversation with the instrument now. She started to improvise. The music became joyful, playful, and free. It was the sound of a soul breaking out of a cage. The shock in the room began to turn into something else. Delight. People were smiling now. Not polite, fake smiles, but real smiles. The man who had dropped his fork was actually grinning. The woman by the bar had tears in her eyes. The contrast between the woman in the apron and the music she was creating was no longer jarring. It was inspiring. It was a reminder that everyone has a hidden depth, a secret talent, a history that you can't see just by looking at them. The manager, Mr. Higgins, felt a chill run down his spine. He realized he had made a terrible mistake for years. He looked at Elena not as an employee, but as an artist. He felt a pang of guilt for every time he had complained about her being slow or asked her to work a double shift. He thought about how many times she had probably walked past this piano, wanting to play, but holding back because she thought she wasn't allowed. Elena's hands were moving faster now, blurring slightly as they struck the keys. She was sweating, a bead of moisture rolling down her temple. Her arms ached, but it was a good ache. It was the feeling of using muscles that had been asleep for too long. She hit a series of high, sparkling notes that cascaded down like falling rain. It was a sound so pure and clear that it seemed to cut through the dim lighting of the room. A few people actually gasped. It wasn't just that she was playing well. It was that she was playing with soul. She was putting everything she had into it, holding nothing back. In that moment, the hierarchy of the restaurant dissolved. It didn't matter who had the most expensive suit or who had the biggest table. It didn't matter that Elena was the help and they were the customers. The music leveled the playing field. They were all just human beings, connected by the sound. Elena's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for a complex run of notes. She stumbled, just for a fraction of a second, a tiny miss of a key. A normal person wouldn't have noticed, but to her, it felt like a shout. Fear spiked in her chest. I'm going to mess up, she thought. I'm going to ruin it. But she didn't stop. She didn't apologize. She turned that mistake into a syncopated rhythm, a little pause that made the next note sound even sweeter. She smiled, just a little curve of her lips, unseen by the crowd. She remembered that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real. She launched into the finale of her improvised set. It was a thunderous, triumphant sound. Her hands were everywhere on the keyboard, crossing over each other, pounding out the bass, teasing the high notes. It was a declaration. She was saying, I am here. I hear you. And I have something to say. The room was electrified. The energy was bouncing off the walls. People were leaning forward in their seats, completely captivated. The politician had completely forgotten his meal. The staff had stopped working entirely. Even the manager was just standing there, his phone forgotten in his hand. Elena felt the end coming. She knew she had to stop soon. Her hands were burning, and her heart was beating so fast she thought it might jump out of her chest. She had given them everything she had got. She began to slow down. The rhythm became less frantic, more deliberate. She brought the volume down, pulling the listeners in closer. It was like she was whispering a secret to the entire room. The notes became softer, slower, gentle. Finally, her hands moved to the center of the keyboard. She played one last chord, a simple, perfect major chord that resolved all the tension that had built up over the last 20 minutes. She held her hands down on the keys, pressing the sound into the wood. Then she lifted her hands away. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't shocked. It was reverent. For a few seconds, nobody breathed. The sound seemed to echo in their minds. Elena sat still on the bench, her hands resting in her lap. Her shoulders slumped forward slightly, the posture of the waitress returning as the magic of the music faded. She took a deep, shaky breath and wiped the sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. She waited for the noise to return. She waited for the clatter of silverware, for the resumes of conversations, for the world to go back to normal. She thought that once the music stopped, the spell would break, and she would just be Elena the servant again. But the silence held. Then, from the back of the room, a sound started. It wasn't clapping. It wasn't shouting. It was a standing ovation, but a quiet one at first. One man stood up, followed by his wife. Then the entire center section rose to their feet. And then the applause broke. It wasn't the polite clapping for a background musician. It was a roar. It was a wave of appreciation that crashed over the room. People were whistling, cheering, and stomping their feet. The politician was clapping vigorously, a genuine smile on his face. The bartender was cheering the loudest. Elena froze on the bench. She stared at the keys, her face turning red. She had expected shock, maybe surprise, but not this. This was acceptance. This was love. She slowly turned around on the bench to face the room. The lights were bright in her eyes. She couldn't see individual faces clearly, just a blur of people standing and cheering. She saw the manager standing near the kitchen, his hands clasped together, looking like he might cry. Elena didn't stand up to bow. She didn't know how to act like a star. She just sat there, a shy, humble smile finally breaking across her face. She raised one hand slightly, a small wave of acknowledgement. The cheering only got louder. The invisible woman had been seen. The silent woman had been heard. And in that moment, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place where a miracle had happened. Elena looked down at her hands, rough, red, and trembling, and realized that they were beautiful after all. The applause washed over her like a wave, but Elena felt as though she were drowning. She was used to being ignored, to blending into the wallpaper, to being the person who cleared the plates while others talked. To have 50 pairs of eyes fixed on her, to be the center of attention, was terrifying. Her face felt hot, and her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. She didn't know what to do. She had seen musicians bow before, but she wasn't a musician anymore. She was just Elena, the waitress. So she did the only thing that felt natural. She gave a small, nervous nod to the room, wiped her hands on her apron, and stood up to leave. She expected the spell to break. She expected the moment she stood up, people would turn back to their steaks and their wines, and the magic would evaporate. But nobody moved. As she stepped off the small platform, the crowd parted for her. It wasn't out of fear, but out of respect. They looked at her as if she were a celebrity, or a saint who had just performed a miracle. The manager, Mr. Higgins, rushed over. His face was pale, and he looked a little unsteady. He stopped in front of her, blocking her path back to the kitchen. For a second, Elena was scared. She thought he was going to yell at her for stopping work, or for making a scene. She braced herself for a scolding. "Elena," he said. His voice was shaking. "Elena, I had no idea." She looked down at her feet, feeling shy. "I just wanted to help, sir. I hope I didn't disturb anyone." "Disturb them?" Mr. Higgins let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Elena, look around." She hesitated, then looked up. The room was still. The angry man at table 4 was actually smiling. The couple in the corner were holding hands. The atmosphere in the restaurant had completely changed. The air was lighter, warmer. It felt like a different place entirely. "Nobody has ever played like that here," Mr. Higgins said softly. "Not in 20 years. Before Elena could respond, a deep voice spoke up from behind the manager. It was the politician, the VIP guest. He had left his table and was walking toward them, buttoning his suit jacket. The room went silent again, everyone watching to see what the important man would do. He stopped in front of Elena. He was a tall man, used to commanding rooms, but now he looked at her with gentle curiosity. "Ma'am," he said, "I have heard that piece 100 times. But tonight, I heard it for the first time." Elena felt her cheeks burn hotter. "Thank you, sir. It is a beautiful piece. Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. "You don't pick up that kind of touch in a few months. That takes a lifetime." Elena looked at her hands again. They were rough and red, but for a moment, she saw them as they used to be, young, smooth, and flying over the keys of a grand piano in a concert hall thousands of miles away. "I was a student," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "A long time ago, in my home country. I went to the conservatory, the National Conservatory." The politician raised his eyebrows. "The National Conservatory? That is a prestigious school." "Yes," Elena said. "I was going to be a concert pianist. That was my dream. I practiced 8 hours a day. All I wanted was to play." She paused, memories flooding back. She remembered the cold winters in the old apartment, the smell of her mother's soup, the feeling of the heavy coat she wore to keep warm. She remembered the day her father got sick and the medical bills piled up. She remembered looking at her younger brother, who had no coat, no shoes, and no future. "But life happens," she continued simply. "My father died. My mother needed help. I came to this country with nothing but my suitcase and my sheet music. I thought I could study here. I thought I could find a way. But—" She trailed off, shrugging her shoulders. "Rent is expensive. Food costs money. I had to work. I worked in factories. I cleaned offices. I worked here. My hands got tired. My bones started to hurt. And slowly I just stopped playing." The restaurant was deadly quiet. Everyone was hanging on her every word. It was a story they recognized, the immigrant story, the story of dreams sacrificed for survival. They looked at the woman in the stained uniform with new eyes. They saw the weight she had been carrying. "I haven't played properly in 30 years, Elena admitted. "I didn't think I could do it anymore. I thought the music was gone." "Well," the politician said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am glad to say you were wrong. And we are all better for it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. He held it out to her, but he didn't hand it to the waitress. He held it out like he was handing it to an equal. "If you ever decide to play professionally again," he said, "please call my office. We hold galas often. We need people who can play with heart." Elena took the card with trembling fingers. She didn't know what to say, so she just whispered, "Thank you." The politician nodded, shook Mr. Higgins' hand, and returned to his table. The spell finally seemed to break, but the mood remained gentle. People went back to their meals, but there was no more shouting. The clatter of silverware was softer. The room felt peaceful. Mr. Higgins turned back to Elena. He looked at the card in her hand, and at the piano. "Elena," he said, "I don't want you to clear tables anymore." Elena's stomach dropped. Panic flared in her chest. "Mr. Higgins, please," she started to beg. "I need this job. I have rent to pay. I can work harder. I promise I will be faster. Please don't fire me." Mr. Higgins looked confused, and his eyes went wide as he realized what she thought. No, Elena, that's not what I meant, he said quickly. I'm not firing you. I'm offering you a promotion. Well, a change. He took a deep breath. I fired the piano player last week. He was arrogant, and he was always late. I've been looking for a replacement. I didn't think to look right under my nose. He gestured toward the piano bench. I want you to play here. Every Friday and Saturday night. Maybe Thursday, too, if you want it. I can't pay you what the politician pays, but I will pay you triple what you make as a waitress. And you can keep your tips. Elena stared at him. Her mouth opened slightly. You want me to play? Here? I want you to play, the manager said firmly. The customers love it. The staff loves it. And frankly, Elena, you look like a different person when you play. You look complete. Elena looked around the room. She looked at the empty plates she was supposed to be clearing. Then she looked at the piano, waiting for her in the corner. She thought about the pain in her back, the aching arches of her feet, the exhaustion that made her cry in the shower sometimes. Then she thought about the feeling of the keys under her fingers. She thought about the silence of the room listening to her. She thought about the music that lived inside her, waiting to be let out. Okay, she said softly. I would like that. A wide grin spread across Mr. Higgins' face. Good, now go take a break. You've earned it. And Elena? Maybe tomorrow we can talk about getting you some better clothes. Something black, but elegant. Elena smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She walked away from the dirty dishes, through the crowd that still watched her with admiration, and toward the break room. The next few weeks changed everything for Elena. The word spread quickly. The story of the waitress who could play like an angel became local news. People came to the Gilded Key just to see her. On Friday nights, there was a line out the door, but the biggest change was in Elena herself. On the first night of her new job, she arrived wearing a simple black dress she had found at a thrift store and fixed up herself. It had a long skirt and modest sleeves, but it looked graceful. She wore a small string of pearls her mother had given her years ago, pearls she hadn't dared to wear in case she broke them. She didn't carry a tray. She didn't carry a water pitcher. She walked straight to the piano, sat down, and adjusted the microphone. The room was packed, but it was respectful. No one shouted. They were there to listen. When she began to play, the arthritis in her hands was still there, and her joints still ached, but the pain didn't stop her anymore. She played through it. She played the classics she had learned as a girl, but she also played jazz, blues, and even songs she heard on the radio, arranging them in her own style. She wasn't just playing notes. She was sharing her life. She played the sadness of leaving her home, the hard work of scrubbing floors, the joy of seeing her children graduate, and the peace of finally being herself. The staff treated her differently now. When she walked into the kitchen for a glass of water between sets, the cooks would applaud. The other waiters and waitresses, who used to ignore her or treat her like she was slow, now came to her for advice. They asked about music, about life, about how to keep going when things get hard. She became a mother to them, a mentor. She made more money than she ever had in her life. She was able to fix her car. She was able to buy fresh flowers for her apartment every week. She was able to send a little extra money to her brother back home. But it wasn't about the money. One night, a few months later, the restaurant was quiet after closing time. The staff had gone home, and the manager was counting the cash in the office. Elena sat at the piano, just playing softly for herself. It was late, and the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the floor. She played a quiet lullaby, a song her grandmother used to hum to her. The music floated through the empty room. It was peaceful. It was safe. Elena looked down at her hands. They were still the hands of an older woman. They were still wrinkled and spotted with age. But to her, they were beautiful. They were the hands that had carried her through the hardest times, and they were the hands that had brought the music back. She stopped playing and rested her hands in her lap. She looked around the dining room. She saw the empty tables, the polished glasses, the stage where she had sat as a waitress for so many years, feeling invisible. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had been seen. She had been heard. And every time she sat down to play, she proved that it is never too late to find who you really are. Elena stood up, turned off the spotlight, and walked out into the night air, her heart full of music. The invisible woman had finally vanished, and in her place stood the artist, ready to play her song for the world.